Thanks, Emma, and thanks to VCOS for inviting us to speak on a topic that is very much front of mind for everyone at the moment and certainly front of headlines. As with most aspects of the global pandemic, the speed at which multiple effective vaccines have been developed and approved worldwide, as well as the scale of the rollout, is truly unprecedented. And look, given what we've had to endure over the past year, the vaccine rollout is certainly something to be celebrated. But it also does have broader impacts that must be considered, particularly in a workplace context. Under the federal government vaccination strategy, vaccination is voluntary. And so the government is relying on an educational campaign to encourage as many people in the Australian community to get vaccinated as possible. Now, state and territory health agencies may make public health orders that require some workers to be vaccinated. For example, those considered to be working in high-risk workplaces. Now, at the moment, we've got Western Australia and Queensland who have either issued public health orders for certain industries or are in the process of doing so. But there are currently no laws or public health orders in Victoria that mandate vaccination in a particular industry or that specifically enable employers to require their employees to be vaccinated against COVID-19. So when employers are looking at vaccination in the context of their workplace, we must look to our existing employment and OHS laws. And the question that many are asking is, under these laws, can an employer require an employee to be vaccinated? Or even are they obliged to require this in certain circumstances to comply with their OHS obligations? But before we launch into these rather vexed questions, and of course the audience questions as well, I think it might be worth taking a step back and considering employers' rights and obligations in this space more generally. So Tab, can you tell me a little bit about an employer's right to direct employees generally?
Yes, so generally speaking, there's a few important steps that employers will look to take before directing their employees. First, they'll need to consider any relevant obligations under an employee's employment contract or any applicable enterprise agreement or awards. And most people understand that they have entitlements and that employers have obligations under employment contracts, but it's sometimes less well understood that there can be additional obligations under enterprise agreements, which are documents that are negotiated between an employer and its employees, or awards, which are legal documents that outline minimum conditions that apply to a range of industries and occupations. So employers will need to make sure that any direction that they are giving is consistent with those workplace obligations and also with any other policies that they may have that would impact these types of decisions. Whether or not an employer can or should direct an employee will also be impacted by obligations under the Fair Work Act and anti-discrimination legislation, and we'll touch on all of that, I've no doubt. But assuming the direction is consistent with any of these obligations under contract, etc., then the real consideration comes down to whether the direction is a lawful and a reasonable direction. And Mel, I know we're going to talk about lawful and reasonable directions a bit in the questions, but if an employer gives an employee a lawful and reasonable direction, then the employee must follow it. So broadly speaking, a direction is lawful if it complies with contracts, awards, agreements, and other laws, which is one of the reasons employers will look to those things first. And the natural flip side, I suppose, of this is that employees are not required to follow an instruction that is unlawful. What is going to be the real tricky part will be what is reasonable. And what is going to be reasonable is difficult to determine. Employees will need to look and employers will need to look at the specific facts and circumstances that apply to their organisation, to their workplace or their workforce. There can be different sites involved, different groups of employees, and also individual employees. So it can be a really complex set of factors, risks, considerations that need to be balanced in reaching that determination of what is reasonable. For many directions, and certainly for directions that we're talking about today in relation to the COVID vaccination, part of that considerations matrix will be taking into account the health and safety obligations, both the employer's health and safety obligation, and also employees have health and safety obligations to themselves and to other employees. So that's it in a nutshell, but unfortunately there is no one answer for when a direction will be lawful and reasonable. It's a determination that is made on a case-by-case basis and will turn on, as I mentioned before, those specific facts and circumstances, and importantly for our discussion, the risks in the workplace.
Thanks, Tab. So you've spoken about risk in the workplace, you spoke about the health and safety obligations. So I think before we actually launch into the vaccine-related questions, it's probably also worth reminding ourselves of what an employer's obligation is to manage risks in the workplace under OHS legislation. And most of the obligations under the OHS Act in Victoria are underpinned by this concept of what is reasonably practicable. Basically, an employer has to take steps and measures that are as so far as reasonably practicable in order to ensure the safety and health of its employees, contractors, or other persons who may be in the workplace. Now, obviously begs the question, what is reasonably practicable? First of all, the legislation requires you to identify the nature of the hazards and of the risks. And then you essentially have to look at the potential severity of these risks. Once you've assessed that, it's then a case of looking at what are your means and methods of controlling those risks? What are the suitability of those options? How effective are they? So for example, in the concept of the vaccine, is it available? Is it effective? Is it safe? Then the last consideration, and it is only the last one, is the reasonableness of the costs involved in controlling that risks. And it is worth noting at this point that the courts and the work health safety legislation have made it clear that cost is only a factor if it is grossly disproportionate to the risk. So it's not one of those easy outs by saying it's too expensive. It must be evaluated against the risk. So having covered off these underlying concepts, we can now, I think, turn to one of the million-dollar questions. Would it be a lawful and reasonable direction for an employer to require an employee to get vaccinated? What do you think, Tab?
Mel, you know I hate to give the answer that I'm about to give, but the answer is it depends. And I hate it. I hate it as it comes out of my mouth, but it really does. It's going to depend on the individual facts and circumstances. And as such, it will be yes for some organisations, for some workplaces, some workforces, and it will be no for others. It will turn on, you know, what is going on in the workplace and those risks that the workplaces will be identifying. Part of the reasonableness factor will, as you've mentioned, include considering whether requiring the vaccine is a reasonable practical step to take to eliminate the health and safety risk in the workplace. And this is certainly top of mind for a lot of employers and a lot of employees, but it's not the only consideration. And depending on the workforce, it may not be reasonable to mandate in all circumstances. Having given my "it depends" disclaimer and assuming it's otherwise lawful, I'm also, Mel, going to give my general feel. And my general feel is that for workplaces where there is a high risk of getting or transmitting COVID, especially risks to transmitting to vulnerable people or people who can't otherwise take some other precautions, then I think the matrix of considerations is going to fall on the side of a direction to mandate being reasonable. This may extend to workforces where there may be an increased risk once international travel truly kicks off again, or where social distancing or other protective measures are just not possible. For workforces in Australia at the moment, where the risk of actually contracting or transmitting COVID is low, then my feel is that requiring the vaccination, which we must not forget is a medical procedure, will not be reasonable. And this would extend to workplaces that can adapt with more remote working, social distancing, and those other protective measures. But this could all change. It's a constantly changing area. So I'll restate my initial caution, which is it really does depend, and it depends on that matrix of considerations.
Thanks, Tab. And so when you're talking about this matrix of considerations, I think that, as you've said, and one of the key questions is whether or not it would be considered to be a reasonably practicable measure under the OHS legislation. So it almost is essentially, I suppose, whether or not it's a step further. So not only can I require my employees to get vaccinated, but do my OHS obligations require me to ensure that employees have been vaccinated? And so I think when we're looking at that point, a really good starting point is looking at both the position of the Fair Work Ombudsman and of Safe Work Australia at the moment. Now, they are both saying that deciding to mandate vaccinations in the workplace does face a very high threshold because they've assessed the community risk and the workplace risks as quite low generally. Because we must remember, and obviously this does fluctuate, that we've got no community infections. We've had no community infections in Victoria for quite some time. We do have 10 active cases, but they're relating to hotel quarantine. So at the moment, Victoria is essentially COVID-free. The low level of restrictions we are currently enjoying does demonstrate that the government considers the risks of catching and transmitting COVID in the general population to be very low. Now, if you look at the systems that workplaces or employers can use for controlling risks, we look at what's called this hierarchy of controls. And at the highest level, you have controls that would eliminate a risk. You then work down through those controls to ones that might merely isolate it, that might substitute the risk with something else, that minimize the risk, etc. Now, vaccination is clearly a pretty high order control. Now, it would, if not eliminate, it would significantly reduce the risk of COVID. But when we look at how that relates to the current level of risk, the question is it too much? Is it too severe? Particularly when you have other controls that are effective and perhaps more proportionate. So we've got masks, social distancing, improved ventilation, as well as things like education campaigns, strong encouragement, etc. So certainly at the moment, the position of the Fair Work Ombudsman and Safe Work Australia and other regulators is that generally in workplaces, mandatory vaccines is too severe. Now, if you look at the high-risk workplaces, which is where Tab has been talking about, it may be more reasonable to do so. Many industry associations have still stopped short of suggesting that vaccines should be a mandatory requirement. And it certainly seems like hotel quarantine might be one of the main exceptions. But it's really important to remember that this is a point-in-time assessment and it's based on the severity of risk at the moment. Now, global infection rates of COVID are at record highs. We're seeing many variants which are causing quite a few problems. If we get more outbreaks in Victoria, in Australia, if international borders open, the risk of community infection may increase and other control methods may be no longer effective. And in those circumstances, certainly the highest order control might be justified. So effectively the answer is at this stage, generally, and it does vary in terms of workplaces and there are more high risk workplaces, there doesn't seem to be enough COVID in the community for the government to be suggesting that vaccinations become mandatory. But it's really important that employers are regularly checking authorised sources, so Ombudsman, Victorian Health, WorkSafe, Safe Work Australia, etc. Okay, you need to make sure you're looking at them because they contain a lot of scientific, factual information about the current state of the infection rates, and they come with their own recommendations, and they are crucial for feeding into your own risk assessment. And it's also really important that you're consulting with your workforce at the moment. Okay, you need to be talking to them, understanding what the risks are in the workplace, what certain vulnerabilities you might have, as well as the approach your employees are taking to vaccines. So you need to know now whether or not an encouraging or an education campaign is going to be sufficient, or if your risk assessment changes and if the risk of catching COVID in the workplace increases, what challenges might you face if you want to try and achieve these high levels of vaccination in the workforce? Now, we have had some questions coming in. So what I think it might be a good one to start with would be considering the question of whether or not if a staff member does actually refuse to come to work because of vaccine concerns. So, for example, they're concerned that their colleague hasn't been vaccinated and therefore they might be at risk. Can an employer initiate disciplinary action?
So there are going to be a range of reasons that employees refuse to be vaccinated. There will be those that refuse for medical reasons, those that refuse based on a protected, an attribute protected by anti-discrimination laws, for example, religious reasons, disability, pregnancy. Those that refuse because they broadly disagree or don't believe in vaccinations, and those that don't have a specific reason but just don't want to participate or are potentially a bit wary. Employers are going to need to have sufficient information about the reasons for the refusal in order to determine whether the direction is lawful and reasonable, and the employee's individual circumstances will go into that considerations matrix. Assuming the request for information is lawful and reasonable, which it's likely to be to comply with the employer's health and safety obligations, then they'll gather that sufficient information, the information that they need. And I must say, to beware of privacy issues when collecting medical information in particular, but for any type of personal information about employees, employers should be careful with that information. Where an employee is refusing based on medical grounds and the employer has sufficient evidence about or information about that those medical grounds to confirm that the vaccination may not be safe for them to take, then the employer will need to consider whether having the vaccination is an inherent requirement of the role. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I want to talk about the other categories first, where an employee is refusing on the basis of protected attribute under anti-discrimination laws, then there will be additional protections and as such additional consideration for employers. So for example, under the Sex Discrimination and the Disability Discrimination Acts, it's unlawful to discriminate on the grounds of pregnancy is a good example, and disability. For people who are pregnant or have a disability, a blanket rule mandating the vaccination is likely to be indirect discrimination under these acts. Broadly, indirect discrimination occurs when a person is required to comply with a general requirement. So there's a requirement across the board, across the workforce to have the vaccination, and they are unable to do so because of that protected attribute, and it has the effect of disadvantaging them. So a direction will not be indirect discrimination if the requirement is reasonable in all the circumstances, but the burden of proving that reasonableness will fall on the employer. So employers must consider if there are any reasonable adjustments that can be made for a person with a disability. And assuming they've taken all of this into account, the question then becomes again, is the vaccination an inherent requirement of the role? The last two categories that I mentioned, so those that refuse because they broadly disagree, and those that refuse not for a specific reason, but just because they don't want to participate or are a bit wary. And we do have some anecdotal evidence that from our clients who are conducting these initial discussions, these initial consultation, is that most people fall into that last category. They're just a bit wary at the moment. For these two categories, the question for the employer will still be, what are the inherent requirements of the role? And the reason I keep talking about this inherent requirements test is that employees must be able to perform the inherent requirements of their job. This is the case even if the employee has a disability, if once the employer has considered all of the particular facts and circumstances that apply to the workforce, to the workplace, to the employee's role, and they decide that having the COVID vaccination is necessary for the employee to perform the inherent requirements of the role, then you could direct them to have the vaccination. And assuming that they don't follow that lawful and reasonable direction. As we discussed before, employees have an obligation to follow lawful and reasonable directions. In that circumstance, then yes, the employer could take disciplinary action for a failure to comply with that reasonable and lawful direction. I must say though, this is very uncharted territory. There's very little guidance from the Fair Work Commission or from any of the courts. There's very little to go by to give some hard and fast rules or get those bumper bars of the edges of what we're talking about. So I definitely encourage any employers who are considering mandating vaccinations, or certainly considering taking disciplinary action, in particular termination of employment, to get legal advice before they do so, because it's really all up in the air at the moment.
Thanks, Tab. And I mean, related to that is actually, we've got a question from the audience saying, is there likely to be a future test case that will determine this reasonableness test for COVID specifically? And could we be found to be unreasonable in retrospect? Or it will be okay if we act in good faith at the time? And that's, I mean, it does just go to the fact that so much uncertainty. Will there be test cases? Will there be future guidance? I'd say so. But in the meantime,
definitely, yes, I certainly agree. I think this is a hot topic. I think there will be workforces or workplaces that do down the track, when the risks in Victoria are a bit higher, do potentially mandate, and that's where we'll see some test cases coming out of that. But certainly, in terms of, will you be judged harshly in the future? I think it really goes back to that, and maybe we've not stressed it enough, Mel, but certainly our recommendation is talking to your workforce, talking to your employees, consulting, discussing. Like, everyone's talking about this anyway. Employers should be out there saying, this is what we're thinking of doing, this is what we're not thinking of doing, and keeping those lines of communication open. It also helps address some of those wary concerns. Sometimes you can let people know you're taking other steps to ensure their safety in the workplace, things like that.
Absolutely. And we should probably mention as well that there are obligations to consult under your OHS and the OHS Act as well. So there's quite strict obligations under Section 35 of the OHS Act. So it's so important to make sure that do keep talking, keep consulting, and that assists in demonstrating that you have acted reasonably in the circumstances, even if the guidance does come out that might point us off in a different direction. And I suppose related to that as well, Tab, is that there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not there might be any liability for employers in certain circumstances. So, for example, we've had one question. So, does this mean that should we be prompted by our employer to have the COVID vaccine and we become unwell, are they liable?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. Look, I'm not, and we're not work cover experts, workers' compensation experts, but I would say very broadly, the test is sort of the connection to the workplace, whether there's sufficient connection there. And I would say if you were mandated and you were required to get it for your job, then I think it has that link to employment and link back to the employer, and there's potentially workers' compensation fallout from that, and things for risks for employers of their premiums and things like that going up. I definitely think there are some risks in that area.
Yeah, and I think also if you look at some of where the other risks might be, so obviously with our OHS obligations, there's a question, I suppose, of whether the regulator would prosecute. Now, I think that looking at it at the moment, given Safe Work Australia's guidance and how the Health Authority guidance, I think that that doesn't look like WorkSafe would prosecute if you don't mandate vaccines, for example. And certainly if you are just following the guidance and then a risk arises or occurs in the workplace, or an employee, for example, were to fall ill in the workplace because you haven't mandated. So let's say you haven't mandated vaccine and an employee does fall ill. I think it's highly unlikely that would see any kind of WorkSafe prosecution in those circumstances as well. The question would be, though, has the employer taken other necessary steps to in terms of managing or controlling that risk? So do you have your COVID safe plan in place? So you ensuring social distancing, masks, sanitizer, etc. If you're looking at sort of more common law as if someone does actually, for example, catch COVID at work, there's a question of whether or not you could prove negligence. It's looking at whether or not there's a duty of care and has that duty been breached. And certainly at the moment where we've got our risk, again, it comes back to that risk assessment where the risk of catching COVID at the moment is pretty low, unless you haven't complied with your other obligations in terms of managing COVID risks in the workplace in accordance with the directions at the moment. It's probably unlikely that an employer would be held negligent in the circumstances.
And Mel, I've just seen a question here, which is one of the things we're constantly talking about, which is, it says here, given the current COVID-19 vaccinations do not prevent transmission, how will the risk be framed? And we're constantly watching the stuff on transmission because there is sort of, my understanding, some evidence that having the vaccination impacts transmission, but Ben's speaking after us, there'll be better ask for him. But certainly that, I think that is a real relevant consideration. So at the outset, we were sort of hearing that the vaccination was going to prevent transmission almost at all. That was almost the language we were sort of hearing in some of the headlines. And that obviously has a different feel for if you have a workplace where you have vulnerable clients. If getting the vaccination stops you from transmitting it at all, that's a very different risk assessment than, I think you're right, the current evidence is sort of pointing that it doesn't impact transmission in that way, at least. Then it does change that risk assessment and that risk discussion.
That's so important to just keep on top of, I think, of the actual, and we've got a National Cabinet meeting today talking about the vaccine rollout. So who knows, we could get off this webinar and things may change. So it's really important that we keep up to date there, I think. Another question we've got, has vaccination become mandatory for travelling interstate? Certainly not at this stage. We haven't seen anything suggesting that that is the case. I'm interested in current approaches about asking staff if they have been vaccinated, given it is private health information. Tab, what do we think about that?
Yeah, look, I think privacy is a big one for this. I mean, from an employment perspective, you can ask your staff for the relevant information that you need to make your decisions, but the collection of this information certainly raises privacy issues, and employers need to consider whether the Privacy Act applies to the organisation. And even if it doesn't, we would recommend adopting some of the best practice steps that you can have in place that ensures you collect, handle, use, store this information appropriately. The Office of the Australian Information Commissioner has specific guidance on understanding privacy obligations to employees when it comes to COVID vaccinations. It's fantastic. You can find it at oaic.gov.au, or I simply Google OAC and COVID privacy, and that will bring up that document. But it's really important for both employers who are covered by the Privacy Act and those that aren't, making sure that you are not asking for information that you don't really need, or asking for information that is just a catch-all in case. Really being thoughtful in your communications, getting the information, only the information you need, and then using it in ways that are appropriate and respectful and also comply with your privacy obligations.
Thanks, Tab. So another question we've got is, I manage a home support CHS program workforce with staff providing personal care support to aged, I think in aged care, to aged in private homes, excuse me. We are concerned that clients will exclude our staff if they are not immunised. Does this change the risk for our organisation and consequently our ability to mandate vaccination in the workforce? So I think, Tab, that this is probably looking more at that inherent requirements of the job piece.
Yeah, it really is. And it's sort of difficult to give you a blanket answer, but if you were having all of your clients stop allowing you to work for them because of the risks, and the risks are real, and you identify them and you can't put in place other safety mechanisms, then it really does, Mel, you're absolutely right, it comes down to looking at whether that is an inherent requirement of the role. And when I talk about inherent requirements, it's probably important to clarify that inherent requirements is something more than just looking at a role description or just looking at what you've previously done. It really is delving down into, and it's kind of in the title, inherent. What is fundamental? What if you took it away? would make the job not the job anymore. So it may be in that circumstance you need to look at if the job can be done in a different way, and if you can't, whether having the COVID vaccination is ultimately going to be an inherent requirement of that role.
Excellent, thank you. We've had another question, which I think sort of goes back to, again, whether or not you can discipline someone for refusing to come into work because others have not been vaccinated. So essentially, from what you were saying in a nutshell, is that it does very much depend, again, on various factors, but certainly if it is a lawful and reasonable direction in the circumstances for them to come in and they're refusing to do so, it could be reasonable to discipline, but probably look at it being a bit of a last resort, really, and see what other things you can deal with.
I would generally be pretty sensitive at the moment. It's understandable. I'd probably want to have a chat to them, get a bit more information about why they say it's not safe to come in. Even under the OHS laws, they still have to, the concern has to be real. So if you actually have a workplace where all of these other protections can be in place, and it's not a real risk, then maybe you could proceed down a bit more of a strict pathway, asking them to come back in. But certainly, I agree with you, Mel. I just, it's it's all a bit tricky at the moment, but I want a bit more. I'd probably want a little bit more information about why they don't want to come in and why they say it's unsafe, and really targeting whether it's sort of a preference rather than a genuine concern about their health and safety.
And I think it's also, as we say, having those conversations and perhaps being creative. I mean, certainly 12 months ago, we'd never have thought we could move people to working from home. And I do appreciate that many roles quite simply cannot be done remotely. But we certainly found out last year that a lot more roles could be done remotely than we'd originally thought. So certainly, let's be creative, have some conversations with your employees to see if there are other ways that you can try and manage the risks, check whether or not there might be a misunderstanding, because there is a lot of incorrect information floating around there. So the educational piece is really important in these circumstances as well.
I should lastly mention, obviously, there are those workplace injury and work cover risks we mentioned before. If you determine that somebody needs to be in and they've said that they're at high risk or they don't want to come in because they're at risk, that those are going to be the other side of the risks that you're thinking about.
Absolutely. I had a question of what are some examples where a vaccine is already a mandatory requirement for a role. So, sorry, go on, Tab.
No. So I know not the COVID vaccination, but in meatworks is an industry where there are a number of vaccinations that are mandatory as part of the work. There are also some workforces which require things like the flu or have required things like the flu vaccination have been mandatory. I'm not aware of anywhere that's any employers that have mandated COVID yet, though. That's I don't know if Mel, if you have a different view.
No, not that they haven't necessarily mandated it. There's certainly been some very strong encouragement, very firm encouragement, but I haven't heard of any across the board mandating yet. So, which is interesting to see. But certainly, again, as we say, given the risk levels keep changing, it will be watch this space, I feel. Another question, and is it not a safe assumption that if the government is not mandating this in high risk instances or workplaces, and this, I think perhaps what this question is getting at is basically, given the government hasn't mandated it, how can we? And look, that's a really good question. And certainly I think there are probably some industries and workplaces that are perhaps feeling a bit frustrated they haven't got some clear advice from the government. Look, I think ultimately what the government is saying that across the board, they're not going to mandate it, they're going to make it voluntary, but they have in all of their material, in all of their guidance, they have said that you still have to ensure you comply with your obligations and you still have to perform your own risk assessments in the workplace. And so they're recognising that it will differ, it will depend, and it's really important. If you've got your own obligations that we've spoken about, and simply saying, well, the government hasn't done it, so I don't have to, would be insufficient. You've still got to perform your own risk assessments.
I agree with that, Mel. I think it's good. You should definitely turn your mind to it. It should definitely be part of your conversation, but it's not sufficient on its own because it doesn't delve into the individual facts and circumstances that we've been talking about. Your workplace could be a unique butterfly, and it needs its own thought process to go through.
It's pretty image like that.
I was trying to think of something nice.
So we've got a question about staff members' right to privacy. My organisation supports people living in the community with a disability. We have clients who have requested only staff vaccinated to work with them. And where does informing clients on whether a staff member has been vaccinated or not sit? It's an interesting one.
Oh, that's a good question. I think that again is definitely my immediate reaction to that is you would not be able, because it's private information of your employees. So I'd be really careful with how you do that. I'm trying to think of a practical solution though, Mel. You'd have to have some kind of communication where you ensured that there was safety stuff in place, but certainly you couldn't just tell your clients if a person was vaccinated or not without the employee's consent.
Yeah, and I think that's
personal, private, and sensitive health information.
Absolutely, and I think that's what it comes down to. Those that is the consent. So have a chat with your employee and say, look, you know, that they want someone vaccinated to be working with them. You know, are you comfortable with us saying that you are vaccinated, or alternatively, you're not? So then it becomes that separate conversation that we've already spoken about of whether they're actually able to perform that role in those circumstances. If an employer does not mandate vaccination for the workforce, is it reasonable to ask whether staff have been vaccinated? And again, I think it's going to that question of not whether or not you can, you know, in fact, ask for this information.
And I think the same answer, look, you can't just go telling other employees about other employees' personal, private, sensitive health information. There are some under the Privacy Act, and again, check the privacy, that privacy note I mentioned. There are some abilities to do it with consent, for example, but I definitely wouldn't be doing it as a matter of course.
We've got another question here that goes to employer liability, which I think is something that's probably at the forefront of many employers' minds. But they said, assuming all cautionary procedures are taken, an employee agrees to vaccinate, so there's not a mandate, it's an agreement as required. What is the employer's liability if unexpected outcome occurs? So we're talking about death after vaccinating. Would it be covered by work cover, etc.?
So with this, I think, I mean, it's going to be in terms of workers' compensation. So I'm just thinking somebody does have an adverse reaction. You haven't mandated it, but you've, you know, encouraged it. I think maybe the link to the employment is a little bit less, but I still think there's a bit of a work cover risk there. But you know, it'll be the Workers' Compensation Authority that determines whether the injury or illness was adequately connected to employment. So again, a bit of that it would be considered based on the individual circumstances.
Yeah, and certainly I think if we go back to looking at whether or not there be some other liability, so if we look at in terms of the regulatory perspective from WorkSafe prosecution, if you've gone through a cautionary procedure, you've gone through all the other control measures, it is voluntary. So the employee, if it's fully informed,
truly informed,
truly
fully voluntary.
Absolutely. I think it'd be pretty unlikely in those circumstances you get a prosecution, or indeed even any kind of liability at common law, because I couldn't really see the circumstances as described there where you could say that you've breached that duty of care if you have ticked all those other boxes. Certainly, most recently, we've seen that there's been, and Ben probably about to speak to this better from shortly, but the AstraZeneca rollout was halted for a week in Victoria as they were trying to work through liability issues for doctors in terms of actually providing this vaccine when there might be these additional risks, and that's what they've been working through. So certainly I would be surprised in these circumstances whether or not, if you were following all the recommendations as they've suggested in this question, that there would be found to be any breach or liability there.
And I mean, it's a good point to note, Mel, it's not actually the employer giving the vaccination, it's through another entity, doctor, thing like, so it sort of falls under that category.
Absolutely.
As well.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, will there be a guide for employers to develop the matrix of considerations? So certainly there's a lot of, there's a lot of stuff around. There's a lot of stuff that's coming out. I'd recommend looking at the Safe Work Australia and the WorkSafe websites. There are regular information coming out that talks about it, and certainly it's being updated quite frequently as well. So there is a lot of guidance as to how workplaces should do that. Also look at your industry associations who are also providing a lot of support to employers as to how best to go through this matrix there. Okay. what about a situation where a client does not want to work with an unvaccinated employee? Best practice to have another worker do the work with a client, but this is not always possible in small organisations. And look, I think we may have touched on this as well in terms of looking at what those inherent requirements of the role are and just talking. And as we've said, seeing whether there's other solutions there as well, which I think would be a good one. I'm conscious that we are getting towards the 11 o'clock, but certainly we'll go through and see if we can answer some more of these faster questions. Do these rules and obligations for employees apply equally to volunteers or ad hoc casual staff, contractors, etc.? For example, site visits by a disability support worker. So from an OHS perspective, yes, you owe these obligations to all individuals that visit your workplace. So it includes volunteers, casual staff, contractors, etc.
And I suppose the key perspective is going to be your OHS perspective, but from a general employment perspective, it's going to depend a little bit. Certainly casual staff would be covered, contractors are likely to be covered through your agreements, and volunteers are generally covered, especially if there's an enterprise or award that applies.
Bit of time to slip one more in. We've got, how does mandatory vaccinations currently work in relation to other types of vaccines, and in what way we expect things to be different with COVID vaccines? And this is an interesting question, because certainly we've seen the comparisons to the flu vaccination, for example. There are certainly roles or industries where you must have a flu vaccination in order to work. We've seen our no jab, no pay scheme in childcare. So it will be interesting to see how COVID is different to that, I think.
And I think the thing at the moment, Mel, and I definitely, look, we're encouraging everyone that we speak to start looking at these issues, be proactive, keep the matrix of considerations changes constantly. But the reality is actually at the moment for employers, most employers, you're not going to have access. So there's a sort of a practical step in the way that's preventing sort of mandating or even rolling out or even encouraging employees to get the vaccination. So it's a bit of a side issue really at the moment while that's underway.
Definitely. Now, I'm waiting to see, I think we might have time for one more. I've been employed since mid-COVID and have completed all work from home. Would it be reasonable to mandate that I get the vaccine to come into the office if I can and have completed all work from home? Which is another interesting one. We're seeing a lot of people come back into work after working from home for a significant period of time, and there is that question about whether or not that can be required and how the vaccination plays in. What do we think about that, Tab?
Yeah, look, I suppose there's two perspectives on this. Firstly, we do need to acknowledge that although everything has been changed and a lot more remote working and things like that at the moment, that has really been in response to a very unusual circumstance, being the pandemic. So it's not the usual practice, or it's not your usual role, the usual way that you work. And now that some of those restrictions, so originally the reason everyone had to work from home is it was government mandated. So those restrictions have obviously come off. So those the reasons that your employer had to send you off to work remotely have, in Victoria, in Australia at the moment, more or less disappeared. So that's kind of one side of it. But I think I agree with what you're getting at, which is the nature of work has changed for a lot of roles, and it may require people to relook at what are really the inherent requirements. So I think Mel touched on this before. Certainly, I have seen some roles that previously we thought part of the inherent requirements was being in the office because there wasn't the ability to work at home. Various things have changed. There now is the ability to work at home. Perhaps actually being in the office is no longer an inherent requirement if you really delve into what is required to perform that job. But certainly there are things that do require face-to-face interactions and do require you to be in the workplace. So there may be inherent requirements that require you to come in, even if you have been working mostly or all remotely for a while.
And certainly I think if in order for someone to come in and work in the workplace safely, if the only way that you can comfortably do that is to mandate a vaccine, is to require them to have the vaccine, and they can work effectively from home, allowing them to work from home, I think, would be more reasonably practicable kind of control order from that risk than requiring them to have the vaccine.
Yeah.
Excellent. Now, Emma, I think we may have run out of time. We've still got so many questions, but hopefully we've managed to answer many of them.
Oh, Melissa and Taboka, I cannot thank you both enough. That's been a fantastic session, and it's really a sincere thanks to both of you and to Justitia overall in terms of your support of today as well. I can't begin to thank you enough. I think you've got a beautiful double act going there, and I know we are going to be back in touch with you because we have so many questions, as you say, in the Q&A section as well. I just want to say a significant thanks as well, because in the last session that we ran, we had lots of employment questions and we just weren't in a place to answer them. And it's been fantastic to have, you know, a really significant part of today set aside to work through those questions. And as you've mentioned, it's an ever-changing space. So I know we're going to hold another one of these events. It would be fantastic if you can come back and I just want to thank you both for your generosity as well. It's very much appreciated. So thank you for what's been a fantastic session. I think we've all learned a lot. And as you say, it's a continually evolving space. So lots more to learn. So a huge thank you to both of you.
No problem. Thanks, Emma. Thanks for inviting us. We enjoyed it.
Thank you. It was fantastic. Thanks so much. And also a reminder to everyone else that we're going to have a copy of this presentation made available on our website within a few days. We'll send you the link as soon as it's available as well. I'm sure you will all agree, lots of fantastic information in that session. You know, as I said, you know, our plan is to hold more of these sessions as well as more information becomes available as well. Justitia, or I should say Justitia, I keep mixing the name up slightly, so forgive me, have also produced a series of other blogs and other videos on this topic, and we're going to share those with you as well because they're fantastic and I think they're going to be a really great resource for all of you as well.